Hey nerds, what's up? Today I want to talk about confusion in fantasy and if there's a good confusion and a bad confusion, and just about how we deal with confusing narratives in speculative fiction in general. See you after the jump. So I've had this video idea for a while because I feel like at some point in every reader's adult fantasy journey, you've been confused. At least hopefully it's not just me. Like, you picked up a book and you just don't quite understand what's going on. And it's something I've noticed a lot as I've been forcing my friends to read adult high fantasy in particular, that they'll often come to me and be like, I was really confused in the beginning, but then I ended up liking it. Mostly it got me thinking about whether or not confusion is necessary in some of our fantasy stories, and if there's a good amount of confusion and a bad amount of confusion, and what the difference between those levels are. So today I want to open up a discussion with you guys and just get your thoughts on confusion in fantasy and kind of what books have confused you and why, and when you thought it was good and when you thought it was bad. It's kind of funny because I was doing a little research for this video and just trying to see in general what the internet thought about confusion in writing, and I found several articles about how to not confuse your reader. Now, these articles were mostly just for regular fiction. I couldn't find anything specifically in fantasy. But one thing that was funny is that on all these lists it was like, don't make up words. Your readers don't want jargon they don't know. And I was like, that's like 90% of our fantasy. But truthfully, I don't think I've ever heard someone say that like the jargon in a fantasy novel is what confused them. In general, when I've been confused or when people I know have been confused and we've talked about it, it generally focuses on two things that I've noticed, which is the magic system and the world building, particularly things like politics or lore. So I came up with 3 things to talk about with confusion in fantasy to kind of determine when there's a good or a bad level of fantasy and what you can do about it. Number 1, experience in fantasy. When I think of the fantasy books I was confused in, both of these fantasy books were pretty near the beginning of my adult fantasy journey. Now, I think this can be a hard move from YA fantasy to adult fantasy because one thing I noticed is that YA fantasy is a lot more concerned about explaining things. There tends to be a lot of things like fantasy schools or protagonists who doesn't know they're magical. And so there are these specific situations where it's very easy to teach your reader as you teach someone in the book. Adult fantasy tends to do this less. Not always, but a lot of times they just throw you in and hope it works out. So the 2 books I think of are Gardens of the Moon, which I know a lot of people get confused with this book now, but at the time I didn't. And then actually Warbreaker by Sanderson. Now again, both of these I read very early on in my journey. And with Warbreaker, I was just like overly concerned that I didn't understand the magic system for so long of the book. By the end I did, but in the beginning I was worried about it. And in Gardens of the Moon, I was just kind of confused the whole way. I felt like I just didn't know enough. Now, what I've since learned is that being confused a little bit about a magic system in the beginning is totally normal for adult fantasy, but it was a feeling I wasn't used to, which kind of leads me to my next point, which is when your expectations are set in the beginning, it makes the confusion feel less confusing. So it's been almost a decade since I first tried Malazan and read Gardens of the Moon, and I read 90% of this book just confused out of my mind. And I honestly was like, I enjoyed it, I enjoyed the book, but I was like, I think I'm too dumb to read this, clearly, because I just don't really quite understand what's going on. But since then, I've discovered that if you go into Malazan thinking you're getting like a typical story about a few characters that will go the whole time a la Wheel of Time, you've really set your expectations in the wrong place. I've since learned that it's really like this overarching story that's really about a world rather than a set few characters. And because of that, you're not expected to know anything, nor will you. And I feel like if I knew that going in, it would be so much easier for me to just like let go of those details I didn't know. And in fact, I do actually want to try Malazan again. I want to get into it now that I'm way further along in my adult fantasy journey. But I think that expectation is going to make a night and day difference. And it actually reminds me of another book, which is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. And this is one of my favorite books of the year. And so I talked in a lot of book groups about this. And several people said they were very confused in the beginning of this book. And I wasn't. So I was kind of wondering why. And one of the big things people who were confused mentioned was that in the beginning of this book, Piranesi is making a map. That's not a spoiler, that's right away. And he's talking a lot about different areas of this map that he is making. And some people were really worried that this was important, so they were trying to annotate it. They were trying to keep track of everything he said. It turns out that's not important. And once they realized that and let go of feeling like they had to know where everything was, then the book no longer became cumbersome or confusing. For whatever reason, I didn't think it was going to be important, so I just ignored it in the beginning. And I think setting that expectation is really important. It's why when I force Warbreaker on all of my friends who don't necessarily read a ton of fantasy, I start by saying, you will be confused about the magic system and it does not matter. Do not worry about it. You will understand it in the end. I think having that expectation going into fantasy helps a lot. If I know that something's going to be confusing, then I can let it go. And that's why I'm so excited to try Malazan again. Basically, if you know the confusion's temporary or it's purposeful, then I feel like it doesn't affect you as much and you're not as worried about it, making it almost less confusing in the process. Finally, number 3, is it confusing at the beginning or confusing at the end? This is one I think is really big for me in terms of if the confusion bad or good. When I got to the end of Warbreaker, I was no longer confused. I was very satisfied by the ending. I felt like I understood everything I needed to understand. And I think this is a very key element. I think if you get to the end of a book or the end of a series and a lot of that confusion is still there, that's when it becomes detrimental to a series. That's when it becomes maybe less enjoyable. Now, a book I can think of that did this to me, and I feel like this is going to be a very unpopular opinion, so I'm sorry, but it was the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. I absolutely loved the first book, the 5th season, but as I continued on in the series, there was just these confusing elements about her, I don't want to say magic system, it wasn't really the magic system, maybe like the lore or some of the world building that just didn't fit together for me. And even when I finished the 3rd book, I was left with this feeling of like, I don't think I quite understood everything in this. I don't think I quite understood the relationships between some of the characters and between some of the magic and world building. And that confusion hurt my enjoyment. It made me feel like I just didn't quite get it. Now, this is probably a book I would understand a lot more on a reread, but I felt like there had to be a certain level of enjoyment the first time around to make me want to dig deeper. For example, like Wheel of Time or Sanderson, and I've definitely heard this about Malazan even though I haven't experienced it personally, they're enjoyable the first read through, but they can be even more enjoyable the second read through because you notice all these details. But the key is they have to still be enjoyable the first time without catching those details. And the Broken Earth just didn't quite do that for me. And it's kind of like the prime example of like, I was left confused at the end and it hurt my ability because I never figured out the things I was confused about. Okay, so I know this was a short video today, but it's just a topic I've thought a lot about, and I'm curious to hear your guys' opinion about confusion in fantasy. Are you someone who's never been confused while reading a fantasy book? Do you care if you're confused? Does it bother you, or do you enjoy just kind of not knowing what's going on? What books have you been confused in, or were there books that you had heard were confusing but weren't for you? Like, I'm just curious about all of that. And if you do get confused, does it tend to be about magic system or lore or relationships or politics? I'm just kind of curious to hear what you have to say. I will say, Malazan is a tired topic. Like, I think most people are confused when they read Gardens of the Moon, so I already know that is one everyone's going to talk about. So I'm kind of curious about other ones that maybe made you feel that way. So let me know in the comments below. I want to continue this discussion. Let me know if I missed any points. Maybe I can do a part 2 if you guys have a lot to say about the topic. As always, if you like this sort of video, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading along with other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.